Welcome to the second season of WIKIMOVE. In this podcast, we discuss the future of the Wikimedia movement. I'm Nikki Zeuner, and with me is Eva Martin.
Hi everyone! Niki and I are part of Wikimedia Deutschland's governance and movement relations team. This episode was recorded on September 21st, 2023. Things may have changed since then, but what we still know
is that by 2030, Wikimedia will become the essential infrastructure of the ecosystem of free knowledge, and anyone who shares our vision will be able to join us. You know, when my daughter heard me saying that, when my daughter heard me saying that, she said, "This is culty." Go ahead.
Go ahead. Does sound a bit, doesn't it? But anyway.
Yeah.
This podcast is also available on podcast apps and YouTube. If you want to reach out to us, you can do so via the WikiMove meta page, or you can send us an email. All the relevant links are available in the show notes. Nikki, tell us a bit about today's show.
Yeah, all right. So on today's show, we're interviewing two non-binary Wikipedians and longtime contributors to Wikipedia. They have fought for better representation and less harassment on the projects for many years. And their experience shines a light on why the movement strategy really was written, particularly the pieces around ensuring safety and inclusion, and around the need to identify topics for impact and to bridge the knowledge gap on our projects. So we will hear from the front lines of the daily grind towards a harassment-free environment and towards ways to appropriately represent trans and non-binary people on our projects.
Talking about safety and inclusion, our movement strategy includes a recommendation on that very topic. It is our recommendation number 3, provide safety and inclusion. The recommendation says, and I'm quoting from the text, we will establish a movement-wide standards for an inclusive, welcoming, safe, and harassment-free environment. This will enable us to better attract and retain new and diverse volunteers and grow as a movement. And even before this recommendation was written, a universal code of conduct was started to be developed. It now has enforcement guidelines to support the communities in ensuring a safe environment for their contributors.
Yet there is still a lot of work to be done. And this is not just about codes of conduct and about policies, but it's also about culture. So the lack of a safe and inclusive environment is one of the causes for the gender gap and other knowledge gaps. So halfway through 2030, which is, the end of the movement strategy as it's written now, we ask, what has improved concerning the safety of our contributors? And what are the challenges that still need to be addressed? And also, what has improved on how trans and non-binary persons are described and represented on Wikipedia and Wikidata. So Eva, you want to introduce our first guest?
Sure. Today we are talking to Pax Ahimsa Gethen. Pax is a queer, Black, trans, blogger and photographer, and a longtime resident of San Francisco. They have been an editor on the English Wikipedia for 15 years, and they have contributed many of their original photos to Wikimedia Commons. Their hobbies include video gaming, word puzzles, playing the piano, and singing. You cannot see it, but they have an amazing piano in their background right now. We are very happy to have you with us today, Pax.
Thanks very much for having me.
Tamzin Hadassah Kelly is a Wikimedian of 11 years who lives with their polycule in Cape May County, New Jersey. They've written Wikipedia articles on topics ranging from LGBTQ subjects to unusual legal cases to Mike Tyson's tattoos. I'm going to look that one up. For non-Wikimedia hobbies, they play board games and take long walks on the beach. Tamzin, so happy to have you on the pod.
Thank you all for having me. Thanks, Pax, for bringing me into this.
Sure. So we would like to start by talking a little bit more about you and your work on the Wikimedia projects. Pax, can you maybe tell us briefly about yourself and what you've been doing within the movement?
Sure. So I have been an editor on the English Wikipedia for 15 years, but I've only been really active the last few, concentrating specifically on improving the representation of marginalized people, especially Black and trans folks like myself. So that's my main focus right now. And I also have taken a lot of photos at social justice rallies and of trans folks, and I use those photos to enhance my article.
Thanks, Pax. And Tamzin, can you tell us briefly about yourself and your work on the Wikimedia projects?
Yeah, like Pax, I've only become more active in the past few years. I write about a lot of things, which includes LGBT subjects. I've written about a Jewish prayer that was written by a lesbian couple. I've written about a zine called "Fucking Trans Women" that was actually the first document published anywhere about transgender women's sexuality. And then, as a elected volunteer administrator, I do a lot of work on our harassment policies and especially hate speech, which is not limited to trans people, but often winds up centering on that because that's currently the biggest culture flashpoint,
Yeah.
at least in the West.
Tamzin, you just mentioned harassment, and that's definitely a topic we need to talk about today. Pax, you've talked in the past about the harassment that you suffered due to your work on the English Wikipedia. Do you maybe want to tell us a little bit more about your response to this harassment and the abuse on the Wikimedia project?
Sure. So several years ago, I think it was in 2016, an anonymous editor who didn't like some edits that I made to a page vandalized my user page on the English Wikipedia, and then proceeded to vandalize my user pages on all the other projects and stalk me throughout the encyclopedia for months. It was a big headache. And anyway, as a result of that year there was an Inspire campaign, which was to propose alternatives to combat harassment on Wikipedia. So for that campaign, I proposed to protect user pages by default from editing by anonymous or new users. So that was my response, and the community fortunately agreed to this. So now there is a filter that users can choose to opt out of, but it's a filter that prevents anonymous and new users from editing anyone's user page. And it's active on the English Wikipedia, but the source is available for other language Wikipedias to adopt as well.
That's very impressive, Pax. And let me maybe just say I'm very sorry that you had to go through all this harassment and abuse.
Thank you.
So
Yeah, it
Tamzin,
was, I mean, even though the harassment just started on my user page, it ended up going on for many months, and the person even stalked me to my blog, and it was very damaging. And unfortunately, trans folks experience a lot of this sort of thing. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg, what I experienced, especially compared to what many trans women have to endure. So even though this user filter would only help in the regard of protecting one particular aspect of this harassment, I just thought this is at least the least that we can do.
So Tamzin, let's hear from you. So if I understand correctly, you are one of a few openly non-binary admins on the English Wikipedia. Correct me if I'm wrong there. So what are the tools that are at your disposal to deal with vandalism, abuse, harassment?
Yeah, I do want to make clear that I try to approach my approach to trans-related vandalism harassment. I try to keep entirely distinct from my position as a trans person. It's not that I feel I would be biased or anything, but I'm opposed to all kinds of bigotry, and it just happens that a lot of the bigotry I deal with winds up being transphobia, and a lot of what people want to talk about. People don't ask me about all the times I block racists, block, religious bigotry, what have you. But I am, to the extent that my background matters, it's that I know what the kind of dog whistles look like. I don't know how internationally accessible a term that is, but when people are saying one thing but they're meaning I hate trans people, and sometimes that means then explaining to other administrators, oh, this comment might look reasonable if you're not entirely familiar with the topic area, but actually what they're saying here is what have you. So I deal with, I've kind of done the article version of what Pax has done, and that I've created an edit filter that detects misgendering of transgender and non-binary people's articles. So like if someone changes every he in an article to she, it will sometimes at least catch that. It's a imperfect system, but it does a pretty good job. And then I follow up on that on the manual side by when an article is getting too much of that, which I mean, no amount is an okay amount, but is getting more of that than our regular processes are able to handle. I'll, in various ways, limit editing to that article for some period of time. And then I've also been outspoken on the idea that that if you're saying hateful things on Wikipedia, that just counts as disruptive editing. I wrote an essay I'm very proud of called Hate is Disruptive, which we had a long-standing dispute over, like, oh, we don't have an explicit policy that says you can't be a Nazi or whatever. And, my intervention in this has just been to say, no, if someone is, well, either using actual hate speech or, pursuing a hate agenda, but also if they're just letting everyone know they really like the Nazis or really like some other hateful cause, that's disruptive editing that we as administrators are empowered to take action against for the good of the community. So I've made a lot of, I've blocked people from editing for a lot of that, mostly not over trans matters, though, mostly over racism, caste-based discrimination, all sorts of things.
Wow. And we will definitely link your essay in the show notes of this episode, Tams. Pax, I know that you've been around in the movement for quite some time, and you are an experienced editor and volunteer. But you also mentioned some of the things that particularly underrepresented groups may be facing on our project. So can you maybe tell us a few words about how can you prepare new editors and maybe particularly vulnerable editors or new trans editors to face the environment on the English Wikipedia?
Sure. Well, in general, I always tell editors who are new to Wikipedia to start out just with things like fixing typos, fixing broken links on just general subjects. Don't try to tackle, subjects like transgender history or anything controversial right away. And then when you're more comfortable with how Wikipedia works and the culture around editing, then you can venture into deeper stuff. But when you do get into controversial issues like being trans, which unfortunately is considered very controversial, you need to realize that you're going to face a lot of transphobic vandalism. And you're going to have to decide how much of that you're willing to accept because it can be very stressful. And I encourage people to take breaks. I mean, this is a completely volunteer job. No one should volunteer to be abused for free or for pay for that matter, but certainly not for free. I've had to take many breaks. I mean, I was just looking at my editing history the other day, and you see, like, in one year I have, thousands of edits, and then the next year it dwindles down substantially because I just had to step away for a while. And so I encourage trans folks in particular to take care of themselves first, because as much as I want more transgender people represented amongst our editors as well as in our articles, we can't do so at the expense of our own mental health.
Yeah, definitely, Pax. Thanks for sharing this.
So one of the things we talked about in the prep calls is that this issue of the neutral point of view. Pax, you said many trans editors get their edits reverted based on the, and you said something like that too, Tamzin, that if you block somebody, you try to stay out of it when it might be a trans or queer issue. So just this whole idea of neutral point of view, I find it so difficult. And this definition of neutral point of view is sort of the knowledge or the people who have edited and run Wikipedia until now are cis male. I mean, let's say it. The demographics are defining what's neutrality there. So anyway, I'm rambling on. Can you talk about this and sort of talk about it from your own point of view?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, what is considered a neutral point of view on the English Wikipedia is that of a straight cisgender white male. And I am
Yeah.
none of those things. I mean, I'm legally male. I transitioned from female to male for legal and medical purposes, but I am non-binary. I'm not straight. I'm black, So, and I'm open about all of these things on my user page, which I certainly do not recommend that anyone be if they're not comfortable with attracting negative attention. But I choose to be transparent about my identity to make a point that I am editing from that frame of reference. And everybody is editing from a frame of reference, whether they consider it biased or not. You can't help but be influenced by being a certain race or gender identity or sexual orientation. And it just so happens that the ones that are most dominant are considered neutral. And so when people accuse me of editing from a biased perspective because I'm trans or because I'm black or because I'm queer, they have to realize that they have their own biases as well. So I think that's really important to emphasize.
True.
Absolutely. I think there's really two concepts that sometimes get conflated as neutral point of view. Neutral point of view, I don't think is actually a great term to describe either. When it comes to article content, what we really mean is consensus point of view. Because on a question like, did the Holocaust happen or is slavery bad? We don't take a neutral point of view. We take the consensus of reliable sources, which is yes to the first question and yes to the second question. I had to remember what whether I posed the second in the positive or negative there. What we really probably should have called it 20 years ago when that policy was written was consensus point of view, because we're absolutely non-neutral intentionally on lots of our articles, and that's a good thing. And I hope anyone who quotes that chooses to quote that with the full context. When it comes to individual editors, right, we don't have any rule about neutrality for an individual editor. And I think, Nikki, I think if I've given you the impression that I stay away from anything because I'm trans, I wouldn't say that. There's some topics or subtopics that I have interacted with in my capacity as an active editor in the LGBTQ topic area, that as a matter of English Wikipedia policy, I'm therefore supposed to not be an administrator too close to anything I've worked on as a content editor. But, I don't consider myself too biased to act in the general concept of trans topics, because if trans admins were, then why not cis admins too?
Exactly.
I have as much or as little bias inherently as any cis person, and I've actually found this wouldn't necessarily have to be the case, but I often am a bit more open-minded on some things than some of our cisgender administrators when it comes to giving someone a chance, because I have seen every possible flavor of transphobia, and there's times where I look at someone and I'm like, oh, maybe if we let this person talk this through, maybe this is going to go in a better direction. And then some cisgender admin's like, nope, transphobic, blocked. I'm like, okay, I was going to give them a chance, but for sometimes you want a block to be made by a more distant person if possible. But I think the kind of misapplication of the neutral point of view policy to individuals has been a dangerous thing and has been weaponized against people from marginalized groups. And that's not even a complaint about the policy. The policy says nothing about individual people's views. It understands, in fact, that editors will be biased, that the sources we use will be biased. And it's all about, if you actually read the thing, which a lot of people don't, it's about reconciling those biases to get the quote unquote right answer. Some people turn that into oh, well, I'm a centrist, so I must be unbiased. It's like, no, centrism is still a bias. Or, I'm in the majority group, so I'm cis, so I can't be biased on this trans topic. Nope, that's still a bias. Everyone has a bias.
True. Tamzin, you just mentioned you being sometimes more open-minded than some of the other cis admin, and actually, it seems like your approach is assume good faith, right? Which is like essential to the Wikipedia project. And I wanted to ask you something. I think we mentioned this in our prep call. It's just a lot of Wikimedians don't know how to write about trans topic in general. And I know that some guidelines have been developed to help them and to guide them. Can you maybe say a few words about it?
Right. So we have been fighting over guidelines on trans topics for like 10 years, we as a community. And after 10 years, what we have is don't deliberately misgender people in the encyclopedia's voice, limit comments that aren't in the encyclopedia's voice that would misgender someone, like quotes about someone before they transitioned, and limit use of people's pre-transition names, sometimes called dead names. That's a pretty embarrassing amount to show after 10 years of incredibly intense discussion. And a lot of it, like if I'm saying this right now from the 30,000 foot view, but if you actually try to write an article on a trans person, a lot of that advice actually isn't that helpful, because you'll just very quickly run into a case of like, oh, this is a quote that's talking about them having gender dysphoria. There isn't really a way I can write that doesn't talk about their gender assigned at birth. And my feeling, as someone who edits in the transgender topic area, is that there's been a lot of desire by people to kind of regulate how we write about this, where it's people who don't actually write about these topics, who maybe sometimes they like it as a thought experiment. They just want to write about that. They just want to like have their take of, oh, this would be the best way to do it. But we routinely have to come up with our own solutions. So in terms of advice for someone who wants to write about transgender topics, the best one is, to the greatest extent possible, prioritize being respectful of the subject. There will occasionally be exceptions where there's no way to write about something without saying something the person might not want you to write about. If you're not, we have this idea in the English Wikipedia of ignore all rules, which is like every rule is meant to be broken. But one thing we often have to tell new users is like, you're probably not the best judge of which rules should be ignored yet. So that applies here too, of if you're writing your first trans biography and you're like, oh, I think this is a case where we should break the normal rules on how we write about trans people, well, maybe go talk to someone who's written an article about this before, and maybe they'll say, no, you can just reword that quote and it will be fine. Or maybe they'll say, oh yeah, that really is an exception. There's no way around this here. But the truth is, like, I like, obviously everyone should read the guidance we currently have, but it's kind of a mess and does not give actually the best guidance, which is a shame. But the community consensus has been pointing toward just not, like, the last several attempts to create new guidance have failed because people have said we've talked about this enough. And like, I think that's correct. Like, I've been one of those people of like, no, we don't need this much micromanagement. Because the other thing is, the biggest issues in our trans articles aren't caused by people who've ever read the guidance. It's by people who don't even know that section of the guidelines exist and are just saying, well, he was a man then, so we should use his man name. And that's been against the guideline for 10 years, and people still do it all the time.
So it's an enforcement
consensus
issue.
building is messy, and you're right, it does get exhausting. I've had to drop out of many of these conversations. I used to really actively participate in any conversation on Wikipedia involving transgender subjects, because not only because I'm transgender myself, but because, again, I am one of few openly trans people on the project, and I wanted to make sure my voice was represented. But it really takes a toll, because these conversations are open to everybody, including just random anonymous people who are recruited on Twitter or whatever to come in and weigh in, and they don't care about the rules, whether they've read them or not. They're just convinced that we're freaks of nature or whatever, and are going to say what they will. And even though those comments can be and usually are reverted, we still see them. And that hurts. I mean, it literally hurts. And some people have a much higher pain threshold for that. But all of us are human beings, and we are, we need to take breaks because it's just exhausting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if I can say two things on that, I mean, I think that's absolutely a great point, that there's a bias in favor of people who have more stamina, who are often the people who have less emotionally involved in a situation, and also the people. And even if someone is emotionally involved on like the offensive, they're usually going to be better at keeping their emotions out of it and looking cool-headed, and that leads to people being perceived as overreacting, maybe actually overreacting just because something's a sensitive emotional subject to them, and then kind of getting in trouble for that, which I don't know if I have an easy solution to, because like you don't, that can be legitimately disruptive behavior, but I don't think our current handling of it is great. The other thing to say is like, one idea that comes up in these conversations is like, oh, all the trans editors want this, trans editors can't agree on anything. Pax and I can't agree on anything. If you look at
That's why I invited you to join us.
Yeah, if you look at the actual history of the guideline, there's people will come along sometimes and say, oh, this portion of the guideline is transphobic, we should change it. And if you look back and see who suggested this, oh, a trans person suggested this. Probably two of the most controversial aspects of our gender guidelines among trans people, which are, one, the rule that we do sometimes like include people's dead names in footnotes in articles that reference them, and two, that we generally don't use neopronouns, which are so I like, one of the sets of pronouns I use is z, them, zer, and our guideline is, no, we don't do that. If someone only takes neopronouns, we use they, them instead. Both those have gotten a lot of criticism from trans people. Both of those were largely supported by trans people, have been defended by trans people. So there's like this fiction of like some monolithic trans cabal that wants the maximal interpretation, and just like read any of these discussions. That's not what happens. And I think that the strictest part of the guideline, which is about like the strictest parts, which are the earliest parts about like dead naming and misgendering, I think were written by cis people. So yeah.
So we want to believe things get better. And I know, Pax, you gave a presentation around the transgender gap in 2016. Do you feel like stuff is improving since then? And talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was a presentation I gave at Wiki Conference North America in San Diego, I believe, in 2016. Just talking about the idea that the transgender gap is not so much a gap in the number of transgender versus cisgender people, because that number will always be skewed. I mean, transgender people will always be a very small percentage of the human population from my perspective, but a gap in knowledge about trans folks. And I feel that that has improved. There's a lot more knowledge about us now. But with that visibility has come, at least in the United States, an increase in violence and backlash against us. I mean, we have 50 different states in this country that have 50 different views and laws about gender and what we can do with our bodies and what we can do legally to declare our identities. And I know that other countries are facing this in various ways as well. But yeah, so I feel like our visibility has improved, but the laws are how should I put this? Our safety is in great jeopardy right now. And this is obviously speaking outside of Wikipedia, but really on Wikipedia as well. If you think about mental health, our safety is impacted there as well. And one of the main reasons that I keep going is because when someone searches for something on Google or another search engine, Wikipedia results are going to come up right at the top. And if the first result that someone sees is a vandalized page about a transgender person or topic, that's going to have a serious impact on if that's a vulnerable trans person, looking for information that could help them, or looking up other transgender people about their lives, and they see vandalism there or hate speech, that's just going to have a terrible impact. So I keep going for that reason. I don't know if this answers your question directly, but that's what I try to emphasize, is the critical importance of Wikipedia, this all volunteer project, to the world at large, which I don't think that everyone appreciates nearly enough.
Pax, I'd like to react to that. So you said trans and non-binary people, their safety is being jeopardized in the society, in the world we live in at the moment. And I would like to just be talking about the Wikimedia movement as a comparison of that. So the movement strategy basically says that we want to create an environment that's safe enough for anyone who shares our vision to be able to join us. And I would like to hear from both of you, how can we make the Wikimedia movement a non-hostile place, a safer place for non-binary folks? And maybe not just talking about the online spaces, but also the on-site space. So when we meet together, when we get this human connection that goes beyond the Wikipedia, how can we make it a safer place?
So, I agree with a lot of what Pax just said. In terms of overall, the world for trans people, I'm on team anti-trans visibility. I think it's been a bad thing more than a good thing overall. I think paradoxically, though, the kind of backlash on trans issues in the US and Europe in the past couple years has probably been beneficial on Wikipedia, because if there's one thing Wikipedians hate, it's coordinated campaigns to push an ideology. And the trans community has often been accused of that with no actual evidence of anything other than individual trans editors showing up and having opinions. And by the way, my earlier point about people getting reverted, it's not necessarily that trans editors are reverted for being trans or anything. It's that new editors are reverted for being new. And most trans editors are new because they tend to be younger and, yeah. So I have noticed a shift in the past 6 months or so on Wikipedia of a lot less back when being transphobic was just some quirky ideological view that was oh, free speech, let this whatever. But now that it's associated more and more with far right views and anti-science views, Wikipedia really violence. But if there's one thing Wikipedians hate, it's not violence, it's being against science. And when they see a movement misrepresenting science, they tend to get very mad. And so in terms of, making spaces, and this is good to just to actually answer your question, Ava, because it's I don't know, you can't make a space safe without having the people be decent. That's the only thing that will ever... You can put up imagine you walk into a space, there's a big sign on the wall that says, no assaulting, people of whatever group you're in. It's not actually going to make you feel safer. It might, personally, it's going to make me feel less safe. It's no assaulting trans people. I'm gonna be why do we need a sign saying this? But if I walk into a space and everyone's treating me decently, honestly, regardless of whatever stereotype I might have of that space, even if it's a place where I think, a lot of people here might have political views that, might skew anti-trans or whatever, but people are just being good to me, that's what makes the safe space. That's what makes the space safe. And so the main thing we can do, as a movement, is education, is competence. I had one user who I warned because they had reverted what they thought was vandalism, but was actually an improvement to comply with our gender identity guidelines. And I said to them, hey, that was incorrect. Please be more careful. And since then, they've come to me from time to time and they've said, hey, this article, goes into a lot of detail about this person's transition. Is that too much detail? And because they've just accepted that maybe they're not an expert on this. They're not the best judge, and instead they'd like my input. And that's been good to see. People need to know what they don't know, and eventually maybe learn enough that they do know.
It's good to use the word safer space, because I don't know if it's possible to have a truly safe space, especially if you're saying for everyone, because everyone is a very large group. Within the Wikipedia movement, I mean, again, these conversations on Wikipedia are open to everyone, including anonymous users, including people that were recruited on specific hate sites to say anti-trans things. So if I want to have a discussion about LGBT subjects with other Wikipedians that I know or have a fairly good idea are LGBT or allies, I won't do it on Wikipedia. We have a LGBT user group that has other spaces that we can gather, and so that's one thing that I have taken advantage of. And of course, this doesn't mean, as Tamzin has emphasized, that we're all going to be in agreement on everything. And I mean, there is not a specific trans Wikipedian group, and even if there was, again, as Tamzin said, we would not all be in agreement on everything, but at least we would have a better idea that there weren't people coming specifically to attack us for being transgender. And as far as being in real life space, I haven't been to a Wikimedia meetup in real space for quite some time, but I did watch the recent Wikimania event remotely. And one thing that I was grateful to learn is that there was a gender neutral restroom, where the restroom that was originally not gender neutral, marked as gender neutral for the duration of the event. And that actually got some negative attention and news coverage in the host city, but it was greatly appreciated by the trans and non-binary folks in attendance, from what I understand. And even though I wasn't physically there, I was very grateful for that. I feel that especially from my own experience, having a lot of stress transitioning from using women's restrooms to men's restrooms. And I know trans women have it even worse in that regard. That's one of the rather small things but actually big things in impact that one can do to make a safer space for trans and non-binary folks, is to make facilities gender neutral where appropriate.
If we're just talking kind of the little things that help with that, gender neutral restrooms, just avoiding gendering wherever possible. Obvious things like don't have Mr./Ms. as your only options for a title. Consider whether you need a title at all. There's cultural implications there. If you're asking someone's name, clarify, do you need their legal name, or do you want the name they like to be called, or do you need both? Because if it's something like, oh, you're going to be getting a scholarship to travel to this event, maybe they really do need the name on your passport, but then they should know that that might not be the name you go by. And again, that's also just like a cross-cultural thing of like, first name, last name fields are very non-accessible to a large portion of the world. If you're asking, and this is always one of my things, though, is if you want to be super progressive and show you support the trans community, asking someone's pronouns is a great thing to do. Making the pronouns field required is a horrible idea that will actually scare away a lot of trans people who might be early in their transitions. I know for me, when I was early in my transition, it was like, okay, if people, or before I transitioned, it was like, if people are going to look at me and think he, him, well, that's not, I didn't say that they said that. So that's fine. Then if a place was like, no, to show our solidarity with the trans community, you need to say that your pronouns are he, him. So thinking about that, talking to trans people, talking to a diversity of trans people, just asking around what would make people feel safer at an event in a given context. All great ideas, but also understanding that no one speaks for the whole trans community, and sometimes someone's idea of, oh, I'd feel way better if this, might be based on their personal experience, and it's a valid perspective, but might not be representative of the entire community.
Maybe as we move towards the end of the interview, I think there's a question I would like to ask you both, and it relates to the world out there and how we fit in it. So we often wonder what the world needs from us, particularly in the context of movement strategy and us growing as a movement towards our strategic direction. And I would just like to ask you, how do you think that the speed of progress in terms of recognizing non-binary people and their rights in our projects, how do you think that the speed of progress within the Wikimedia movement is in comparison to the society we live in?
I can only speak from my perspective as a US American to emphasize that, because I realize this is a global audience, and I always want to emphasize that that's my frame of reference. I do feel that the Wikimedia projects at large are somewhat more advanced of the current state of recognition and respect for transgender and non-binary folks. Again, this is from a US perspective, and it doesn't mean that it's perfect. It will never be perfect, but if it weren't at least equal to, if not better than, the state of dialogue around trans or non-binary folks in the US, I would be much less inclined to participate, because again, my mental health is at issue here. So that's my current assessment, subject to change.
Tamzin, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think, trans rights in the US and UK, and maybe I'm less qualified to talk about other countries, are moving somewhere between moving backward and at a standstill right now, depending where you look. As I said before, I think that has had some kind of perverse positive effects on Wikipedia, because it galvanizes things and forces people to take a side. There's a paradox there that, Wikipedia is not a reliable source. We're also the source a lot of people base all their knowledge on. I don't know if you've had this experience, Pax, but I've definitely written an article, and then a few months later, I look at news coverage of that topic, and it all presents it the exact same way I present the facts. It's not necessarily a new facts. It's just they've now synthesized it as, these are the details that matter, and it's based on what I say. So I do believe, Wikipedia has the potential to be incredibly influential for good or for bad on these topics. And that's not me saying, oh, we should advocate for the most pro-trans reading of things, because there's lots of topics where the pro-trans reading might not necessarily be exactly what the sources say. They might take a more, for instance, satisfaction rates after bottom surgery. The current sourcing is middling positive, where I think most trans people would have a significantly more positive view of that topic. And I don't want it to say what the average trans person thinks. I just want it to say what the scholarly sources think. But often that's not what's in the article. And that really has potential to do tremendous good or bad on an issue that a lot of people are hearing about for the first time and just want to know the basics on.
Yeah.
And a single misleading sentence could be all it takes to make a person think, oh, so this is bad. Okay, I got it.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Very true.
Those are great last words on the power of the project that we're all working on. And
everyone's favorite unreliable source.
That's a very
I want
nice
to thank
way
you
to
so much for I want to thank you so much for spending time with us. This was fascinating discussion, and I learned a lot, and I hope we'll get lots and lots of listeners who also learn from this, and who maybe can extrapolate some of what you say also to other situations and interactions and marginalized groups, and just generally to make our movement a nice place, a nicer place, a decent place, like you said. So maybe we did a little bit towards that today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our two wonderful guests. This has been very insightful, as Nikki just said. WIKIMOVE is a production from Wikimedia Deutschland and its governance and movement relations team. Our music was composed and produced by Rory Gregory and is available under CC by SA on Wikimedia Commons.
You can visit our WIKIMOVE meta page to listen to previous episodes and suggest topics and guests for our next season, or for next episode, actually, because we're just in the beginning of season 2. You can also use our meta page to react to podcasts and connect with other listeners and subscribe to always be notified of our new episode releases. You can contact us at wikimove@wikimedia.de to continue this discussion and share suggestions for the next episodes. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Tschüssi. Au revoir.
Ciao.
You have to say au
Au
revoir.
revoir.